Life hasn't been quite the same after COVID-19, and neither has journalism. Back in March, newsrooms were suddenly flooded with stats and numbers, changing data very much, changing all the time, and unreliable data at times. So they needed to understand, to process and translate for their audiences in the most comprehensive way what was this data about. So we'll be taking a look today at the Financial Times Trajectory Tracker, which started out as a simple graph to help people visualize the rising number of coronavirus cases and deaths per country. Well, as more people found out about the tracker, they went online to ask for data on more countries and for more specific information, which turned it into kind of an internet sensation. So today we are joined by Burn-Murdoch, the brain behind this tracker, who will share with us how this data tool captured the attention, the interest, and most importantly, the trust of thousands of followers, and brought in new subscribers to FT. So welcome to NIS Data, John.
Thank you, Vera, and thank you, Anna, as well. And good morning, everyone. It's a real sort of privilege to be here with you all. Yeah, so that's right. I'm just going to be talking really about how the work we've done at the FT over the last, well, almost a year now. I think we're on to about 9 months that our pandemic tracker pages have been live. So I'm going to talk about how that came about and why we think it has particularly resonated with our audience and indeed expanded our audience. So really this is about, I think, how data journalism has matured and has certainly become seen as much more valuable by both readers and senior figures in newsrooms during the course of the pandemic. I've been working in data journalism now for about 7 or 8 years, so I personally appreciated the value that data journalism can bring for a long time now, but I think it just has been really apparent how that has cut through to much wider and more senior audiences in 2020. So this is the chart I think that a lot of people will be familiar with. This, as you were saying just then, Vera, is a chart that was initially done actually just as a sort of one-off graphic after one of our news reporters asked me the question back in early March of what do we know about whether other countries are on the same course as Italy? This was at a time when Italy, of course, was in the news headlines on most days with rather tragic scenes as the fatalities piled up in Lombardia. And what we wanted to do really was see if we could answer that question in chart form to show people whether they were on course for seeing similar figures and similar pictures as we were seeing in Italy. And so this was the chart that I produced. And as I say, when we initially made this, we just thought, okay, making charts is what we do at the FT. We'll put this one out there and that will be that. But it turned out that people got a huge amount of value from this. It really resonated and went on to be sort of one of our iconic charts that we updated manually every day, essentially since March. And this is what happened to traffic to our coronavirus tracking page when we added that chart. So we actually published this page on the 9th of February. At that time it had a couple of maps in there. It was obviously more focused on the Asian region. But what you can see with that black arrow there is when we added this chart and a couple of sort of sister charts, as it were, to the page, focusing more on that reader question, that public question of when will other countries and will other countries at all be on that same path as some of the hardest hit parts of the world. And you can see how traffic to that page really shot up, really rocketed when we included this stuff that was more explicitly answering questions that readers had. The other thing you might notice there is this dark blue area on that chart, which is essentially absent for that first couple of months, but then becomes very large. And that's the amount of traffic coming to our page from social media. So again, I think it really demonstrated how, first of all, answering questions that the readers had explicitly in our charts. And second, going out to the mass audience of social media, particularly Twitter, and really bringing this information, these resources to people directly was hugely valuable. This was obviously a pandemic where millions and millions of people were checking social media and other news sources every day to find out what was going on. And by making sure that our information was in that sort of primary space for them, we were able to get it in front of a far bigger audience than we usually would. The FT obviously has a solid readership at any time, but what was clear with the work we were doing on the pandemic was that it was cutting through and reaching far more people than we typically would. So we also went on to do things like we took the paywall down on this page. You can see that in the latest spike around the 22nd of March, because we really felt it was critical, even as a subscription-based news organization, to get this information in front of as many people as possible. And what we've been doing, this is both stuff that on the data team we've been doing, but also our brilliant audience engagement team has been looking into exactly what data and visual journalism does for the FT and indeed for our readers. And what we've found is that when you consider a concept like engagement, which we're defining here as the length of time our readers spend with a piece of journalism, the distance they're scrolling down the page, how much they're really sort of focusing on the information presented to them. We found that all of the work that we've been doing, which features data and visualizations over the course of this year, has actually got higher engagement by that measure than the work that doesn't feature visual journalism. So including charts and data in stories actually leads readers to spend more time with our work. We're also finding, as I mentioned, as a subscription-based organization, that this really supports our core goal of getting more people to make those visits to the FT more frequent and staying with us for longer. So if you look at the percentage of people who subscribe to the Financial Times off the back of reading any given article or any chain of articles, we also find that that's higher in content that contains a lot of visualization and data. So again, lots of evidence that as well as the sort of vocal and strong reaction this stuff has been getting on social media, it is causing more people to appreciate what the sort of breadth and quality of work that the FT does, and that, you know, we are a financial news organization, but we're not only a business and finance news organization. We cover the world in much greater breadth and depth than people might have otherwise thought. And we can see explicitly as well people actually saying this. So a couple of examples here: one email on the left and a tweet on the right of people saying quite directly that it was the work that our team was doing in terms of bringing data and visualization to tell the story of the pandemic that was directly leading people to subscribe. And this was even after all of that work was outside of the paywall. So it's an interesting demonstration there for newsrooms around the world. I think that for paywalled organizations, if you make something free, that doesn't mean people won't still end up subscribing. It's really, you're demonstrating that you care more about informing your audience than about making money, and people actually, you know, surprise appreciate that gesture and what it means. And we've continued to have messages like this right through the months up until even the last couple of days of people talking about how it was our visual work that has led them to become FT subscribers. So an important part of this is that it's not just about getting some data out there, putting it in a nice colorful presentation and expecting a good reaction. Newsrooms all around the world have been doing a huge amount of visualization work over the last 9, 10, 11 months. But what I want to talk about is how we at the FT particularly optimize the visualizations we produce for that mass audience. There can be a tendency in some parts of the data visualization world to focus on complexity and elegance and intricacy and let's say sort of coolness above actually focusing on the clarity of the message that you're getting across. And that will tend to get a very positive reaction from a certain crowd of people who are very visual, people who are really into data visualization already. But there's a much bigger audience out there of people who maybe they don't think of themselves as numbers people or charts people. And when you focus on making something as sort of cool and shiny as you can, you risk sort of losing those people and letting them think that you're not really speaking to them, that you're doing something for the nerds, as it were. So what we really focus on at the FC is making sure that without sacrificing any elegance or aesthetic qualities of our work, we produce work that can really be understood by a mass audience and a diverse audience in terms of its experience and comfort of working with data and visualizations. So what we do there is we focus on work, including this scientific paper from a couple of years ago, about what it actually is that makes people remember and really be struck by and take away messages from data visualization. So what I'm going to show you in a second is an animation, a screen recording essentially of what these researchers in Washington in the US found, which was they gave an audience hundreds of charts to look at and asked them to just stare at these charts for as long as the chart was in front of them and take away as much information from these charts as they could. And they used eye tracking software when people were doing this to see where are people actually looking, where are people focusing when they are given a chart and asked to take in that information. And so you're going to see in a second this animation showing a blue dot, which shows where people's eyes go when they're presented with a chart. So what you'll see is this blue dot goes straight up to the title there, and this animation will loop, so we'll see it a couple of times. They focus on the title, they read those words, then they come back down and look at some of the other details of the chart, like what's on the vertical axis, and then they read across the actual content of the chart itself. But the key thing is there's a lot of time first spent on the title. And what the authors found there, and this is another way of showing that same data, is that when people were asked to remember those charts and describe what was in those charts, their descriptions mentioned the title, the labels, the paragraphs, all of these text objects, much more than they actually mentioned the contents of the chart, the plot itself. Now, obviously, we're in the world of data visualization here. We're not saying stop making graphics, but what we are saying is text is critical when you want to make graphics that are understood by a mass audience. There'll be a lot of people who, if you just present them with a chart, they're not really sure where to look. They're not really sure what their takeaway should be. But if you use that title and subtitle to set the scene, you immediately give people a message to grab onto, even if they don't see themselves as charts or data people. And that's been critical, I think, to how our work over the last few months has cut through. So this was the first sort of rough version, of the chart that we produced back in March. And you'll see that there's very little text on here. It's still the sort of the geometry, the decisions of what we're showing on this chart are still the same as what we eventually used. We've got the number of days since each country's outbreak really took off along the bottom, and we've got the number of cases in total going up the side. But there's no information here actually telling people what's going on. So even though the decisions of what and where and how to show things on this chart are the same as in our final one, there's no way this chart would have resonated with a mass audience because people wouldn't really know what they're looking at. Whereas when you see the final version, those shapes, those lines, that choice of countries are exactly the same. But what we've done is we've added this title with the key message that most Western countries are indeed on the same trajectory. They're following in Italy's path, whereas countries like Hong Kong and Singapore in Asia have managed to slow the spread. We've also got these annotations on the right-hand side of the chart telling short stories about what's going on in each of those countries so that people aren't just left scratching their head thinking, what is it that they did differently? They can actually see why it is that certain countries may have fared better in combating the virus than others. And it's this messaging that people really grab onto, whether this chart was on our own website or on social media. We can see from the number of people who screenshot the charts on our site and share them on social media that the message is cutting through to them in the page itself. So I just want to emphasize that wording on charts is critical. As you know, we're a species that has been taught to read. It's one of the best ways that humans can communicate quickly. And I think by focusing on good quality, engaging narrative titles and other text on our charts, we can really ensure that our charts and our data visualization work is getting through to as wide and as sort of multi-skilled, multifaceted audience as possible. This was another version we did later on where the story had changed. So we changed the title on the chart. Again, making sure that we had new and fresh information that would cause people to keep coming back to this part of the site. Another key thing we've learned is, and this may seem obvious to some people, is that it's critical that you respond to user feedback when you're putting out data visualization products like this, which are regularly updated. And it's critical that you take on board that feedback, even if you happen to disagree with it. So one of the things that some of our audience were struggling with these charts, and I'll just flip back a second, was that The vertical axis on these charts here is what we call a logarithmic scale. Those numbers go 100, 200, 500, 1000, 2000 there. It's not the usual even breaks that you get in a chart, but that's deliberate. That's because when a virus is spreading exponentially, when each person infects a larger number of people, what you want to do is show that data so that an exponential rise, which would normally arc upwards, becomes a straight line. So it's easier for people to tell what's happening next. But what we found, and it might not surprise you, is that threw some people. There were plenty of people who they kind of understood what the chart actually showed, but they felt like that sort of flattening off of the vertical axis was somehow downplaying the severity of the disease. It was making it look like as the numbers got worse, they became sort of less bad, or it made it look like the numbers of deaths were actually smaller than people felt. Now, again, we had our own sort of scientific and data visualization based justification for doing that, but it was clear that it was causing people some confusion. So our response was we created this interactive version of the chart where people, among other things, could choose whether to use a linear or a logarithmic y-axis. And you can see the chart here using a linear version. And the key there is the customer is always right, as it were, when it comes to data visualization. We need to make sure that our data and our graphics are presented in a form that cuts through to everyone, that doesn't mislead them, even if it misleads them through reasons on their end rather than ours. And that was one big takeaway. We also found more broadly that it was really helpful to actually treat these charts as essentially a product, a journalistic product in and of themselves, and to really encourage people to get in touch with us as if we were our own sort of mini newsroom. So we set up our own email inbox just for coronavirus data at the FT. And you can see back in April here, this was a completely full page of the inbox, and it was more than one page just from one day. And it's people, some people just saying thank you for the charts. It's some people saying, have you considered adding additional charts or additional countries to these charts? It's some people actually saying, here's data for my country, why don't you add that? And it was just clear that by engaging with our readers like this, we were able to really foster much more sort of excitement, enthusiasm, and ownership around these charts, and to ensure that these people were coming back to the page every day because they really felt like they were sort of part of a family or a conversation here. Another thing we found is that COVID has become very sort of polarized over the last few months. I'm sure this is the same in all the countries that you're from. There are some people who think that the virus is being downplayed. We're not talking about it seriously enough. And there are others who think that it's being exaggerated. So another thing we've tried to do in our charts is make them as accessible and as appealing to people on each side of that debate as possible. So here's an example of one looking at how deaths have been rising in European countries in the autumn as we turn into the winter. And what we focused on here is showing the spring, where figures were rising much more steeply, alongside the autumn, so that while people see that, yes, numbers have been rising over the last few months, it's not as dangerous, it's not as steep as it was in the spring. So whether you're someone who's a bit more skeptical or more worried, there's an entry point for you into this chart, and you don't feel that we're just trying to push one angle. Finally, we found, as always, that the best data journalism often means going out and actually getting better data than already exists out there. And the clearest example we had of this was back in the spring when in Ecuador, in South America, the official numbers that the government was reporting made it look as though their death toll was relatively low. It was only around 18 or 19 deaths per day, which was far lower than many other countries. But at the same time, we had reports from our own correspondents in South America that the truth was far, far worse. And there were actually vultures circling the city streets where bodies had been piling up in cardboard coffins. So we went away to find better data from Ecuador that could tell the story more accurately. And we found that when the official figures had been talking about around 17 or 18 deaths per day, the true figure was around 600 or 700 deaths per day. We ended up doing that for a couple of dozen countries around the world, and we've continued to update that data. So it's really shown, I think that's shown to readers that we care more about getting to the truth than just using the most readily available information. I think that's always a key lesson for data journalism. So thank you very much for listening. I think we might have a couple of minutes now for some quick questions. So I will go back to Vera and Anna in the studio.
No, to me, John. Hi, how are you? Good morning.
Hi.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we have some questions here. We will start with Simona Visiani. Simona asked, you guys mentioned this work got the FT new subscribers. At the same time, we talk about erosion of trust in media, furtherly aggravated by the pandemic. Where do you think we stand now?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And yeah, sorry, Angela, I forgot who I was going back to. I think what's been really clear again is that the pandemic has, yes, it's demonstrated that a lot of readers do lack trust for the media, but I think it's really highlighted the journalism that does encourage trust. So again, I think the fact that at the FT, we were putting this work out there, we were asking for feedback, we were asking people to tell us if they thought we were doing something wrong or if they thought we could improve something. And that, I think, really shows that we cared about what readers think, and that the question we were trying to answer with our work were the questions they had rather than the questions that we or our editors had. And I think any newsroom that has been doing that has been prioritizing just getting information out to readers rather than sort of pushing a specific angle, a specific interpretation, as it were, I think has really shown readers across the world that there still are hundreds and thousands of journalists who are trustworthy and really care about getting people the information they need for their daily lives.
Great, thank you. We have now Umar Hassan. Umar asks, how important is that visual journalism creates opportunities for audiences to invest in a monthly or yearly subscription?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like every other bit of journalism. It's the single most important thing is that we serve our readers, whether we're asking them to pay or not. We need to be getting the best information out to them. But I think this does just demonstrate that charts, graphics, and data are just as much, they're equally the kind of journalism that people value and are willing to subscribe for as words, as written journalism. And so I think anyone who's producing these ambitious visual projects should absolutely be thinking about them as overarching sort of strategic goals for increasing their audience, as well as simply sort of cool and whizzy things that readers might like.
We have a question also from Miguel Roca. Miguel asks, how do you source that extra data from Ecuador?
Sure. So that actually came from medical departments and health officials in Ecuador who were telling the government in Ecuador essentially the same thing as us, which was that the official statistics just weren't capturing adequately the number of cases and deaths in the country. So whereas the government was doing the same thing as most countries and saying how many people have lost their lives following a positive test, what the medical department was doing was saying, we're just going to tell you how many people have died of anything, because clearly the testing wasn't up to scratch. And so we used the data that they were publishing in sort of PDF format on their own website to sort of improve upon the official figures based on testing.
And we have time for a last question from David Bush. David asks, which programs and tools do you mostly use for data analysis and visualizations like this? Sure.
So most of this work we do using the D3 JavaScript library. So that allows us really sort of fine-grained, detailed control to really determine every pixel on the page. It also allows us to make things interactive. There are other tools out there as well. We were initially using the ggplot package from the R statistical library, but in the end, D3 is what we're making all of these charts in.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, for your time this morning and for explaining us what you're doing on FT. Fantastic work.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, John, for revealing some of the magic behind the Financial Times coronavirus tracker.